Hey, John Lamberton here. This is the Woodshed episode 20. Today I want to talk about dotted and double dotted rhythms. And so basically, how do they work? What are they? What's the point of them? I think that the way that I like to think about these is a little bit clearer and more useful than how they're usually explained. And so I'd like to just touch on that and a slight gripe that I have with the notational standard. And then at the end, I will get into some creative applications that generate some interesting cross-rhythmic grooves with what I call truncated polyrhythms or pseudo-polyrhythms. So without further ado, let's get into it. So to start off, what is a dotted rhythm or a dotted duration? And if you've been around musical notation whatsoever, you've probably already seen this. Basically, the idea is you take a base value and you add 50% of that base value. So in the case of a quarter note, what is 50% of a quarter note? It's an eighth note. So a dotted quarter note becomes basically 3/8 notes worth of rhythmic value. Cool. So what's interesting here is this is kind of like, in some ways, the opposite of a triplet. A triplet tries to fit 3 in the space of 2, and the dotted note fits 2 in the space of 3. So, if you're in a bar of 3/4, you can have 2 dotted quarters, and that's essentially saying 2 in the space of 3. You could actually notate it as tuplets or some sort of polyrhythmic notation, like a duple in the space of 3, and it means the same thing. There are actually a bunch of ways to notate these same rhythms, but the dot is kind of like, it's essentially saying we use this enough that you might as well just put a dot instead of a tuplet. So that's pretty cool, I think. And so this gets at the notion of utonal and otonal. So otonal is kind of overtone derived and utonal is kind of undertone derived. This is something that comes from Harry Partch's music. And I think this is interesting because, the triplet is essentially our third partial. It's basically like the perfect fifth of rhythm. And so the dotted note is kind of like the perfect fourth of rhythm. So by just having triplets and dotted notes, then this kind of gives us a 1, 4, and 5 sort of underlying harmonic sense, if you will. You could actually look at blues form and sort of think of it as combinations of these. It's like when you go to the 4 chord, you're essentially going to dotted notes. When you go to the 5 chord, you're essentially going to triplets. Anyway, something interesting to consider. So what about double dotted notes? All right, so what is a double dotted note? Basically, it's very similar, but after getting that first 50% of the base value from the first dot, then we do 50% of that 50%, so a quarter. So in the case of a double dotted note, it's base value times 1.75, 1 3/4. Similarly, you can do the sort of thing that we did where you borrow a different tempo by superimposing an exponent of 2 meter over our 3. You can do that same thing with the 7 with double dotted 8th notes or double dotted 16th notes or whatever. And so I think that's a cool aspect of this, which means that this is, much like the dotted note is the inversion of a triplet, this is basically the inversion of a septuplet. So septuplets try to fit 7 in the space of 2, and double dotted notes try to fit 2 in the space of 7. So pretty cool. It's yet again another utonal version of the otonal septuplet. I mentioned that I have a gripe, and I just wanted to briefly touch on it because it's not that interesting to people who aren't me. But if we have dotted notes and triplets as kind of these otonal and utonal companions, we have the septuplet and the double dotted note as also the 7th harmonic and the 7th subharmonic rhythmically. What we're missing is a sort of utonal reflection of the quintuplet, which would be our pure third in the rhythmic domain. So triplet gives us a perfect fifth. The septuplet gives us a harmonic 7th. That's kind of like our hello, 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 hello. That 4th hello is the harmonic 7th that would have a flattened sort of ringing quality to it that you don't get with the tempered 10 semitones. But you invert that, you invert the perfect fifth, the third partial, and you get a perfect fourth. Invert the harmonic seventh, you get a pure second, basically. And so then the quintuplet, that would be our pure third, but there's no reflection of that we can do rhythmically. And I think that would be pretty cool to have, because that would be to say, fit 2 in the space of 5 the way that a quintuplet fits 5 in the space of 2. And I think that the sort of best solution for this would be to actually have double dotted notes mean, to take up 2 in the space of 5, sort of be the quintuplet reflections, and then have triple dotted notes be the reflection of septuplets. But the way that we have it right now is like, base value, 1 dot adds 50%, 2 dots adds 50% of 50%, 3 dots adds 50% of 50% of 50%. So that means a triple dotted duration, like a triple dotted quarter note, would be 15 30-second notes. And honestly, that's not helpful whatsoever. Of course, nobody's going to take on this solution of making double dotted sort of utonal quintuplets and triple dotted utonal septuplets. But I just think it's worth mentioning because these things are generally described as kind of like, each new dot gets you a 50% of the last 50% of the base value. That's the way that's usually talked about, and we don't usually get this sort of description that's referencing Parch and his subharmonics versus harmonics type of conception. All right, so I mentioned that I wanted to sort of talk about a rhythmic structure that I like, that takes advantage of these notational conventions. And I call it the pseudo-polyrhythm or the truncated polyrhythm. And this is actually something that emerges naturally out of a lot of dance musics, basically from the interplay between sort of secondary pulses that you can't continue to repeat without either going over the bar line or without truncating it to fit the bar line. So, the sort of classic example of this is you're in 4/4. Maybe you think of it as 8/8 notes or 16/16 notes. And so you could say, how many groups of 3 can I fit into 8? Okay, I can get 3, 6, and I have a remainder of 2. How many groups of 3 can I fit into 16? Okay, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. I get a remainder of 1. You can do this with whatever you want. You could say, how many groups of 3 can I fit in 19? I can get 6 groups of 3 with a remainder of 1. And so there's always going to be this kind of like secondary pulse happens this many repetitions with a remainder added at the end to round it back to the normal meter that we're going by. And so I think this is a pretty cool thing that you can do, and it's made very easy by using dotted notes. So you can just say, 5 dotted notes plus 1, the remainder of 1 at the end. So it's kind of like 5 big pulses, 1 small pulse at the end. Similarly, you could do this with double dotted notes. So let's say we're in 4/4, we'll skip past 8/8 because that's just going to be 7 with a remainder of 1, which doesn't really count. If we're in 16, okay, I can fit 2 7s in with a remainder of 2. What about, 32? I can fit 4 7s in with a remainder of 4. Or if we say something complicated like, I'm in 19, okay, you could fit 2 7s with a remainder of 5. Or if you, double that and you 38, let's say we're in 38-32 or 38-16 or something like that, you could say, okay, 5 groups of 7/16 plus 3/16 at the end gets me 38. So and so I think this is an interesting way to just generate cross rhythms that set you up with the expectation that a polyrhythm's happening. In that case of the 38 example, when you hear 5 groups of 7, like that's already sort of making you think, okay, I'm in like a 5 against 7 polyrhythm. I don't think that anybody's consciously thinking that, but when you get that truncated 6th pulse, which is only 3 of what you're expecting to be 7, and that resets you, the bar line is at 38/16 notes, then it's kind of like you were set up with that expectation of a certain polyrhythm, and then you had the actual global meter revealed to you at the end. So Anyway, this is what I call the pseudo-polyrhythm or truncated polyrhythm. And if you want to check out a really cool example of it from the real world, I would suggest Ben Monder's Rooms of Light. So there's this Clave Pattern. The tune's basically in 6/4 or 3/2, some sort of groove like that. And there's this Clave Pattern that he got from Guillermo Klein. And it basically takes 3 groups of 7 and then adds a group of 3 at the end. So like 1, 2, so you end up getting 24/16 notes, which you can reduce down to 12/8 or 6/4 or 3/2. So you end up getting this sort of big pulse of the half note. You get 3 half notes, but then you also have 3 groups of 7/16 with a 4th pulse that's less than half of that. So it creates this sort of jagged rhythmic structure that resolves in a sensible way, but it doesn't have the same symmetry as a polyrhythm. And to make things a little bit more complicated or more interesting, basically they take that smaller pulse of the 3 and they move it around the phrase. So you can have different variations here, which are 7/7/7/3, 7/7/3/7, 7/3/7/7, or 3/7/7/7. And so whichever way you do it, it's going to equal 24/16 notes, but you're able to sort of move this hiccup around the phrase, and it's a pretty cool device. And so again, you can apply the same general idea to whatever meter. And so like instead of doing 7/7/7/3, you could do maybe say your global meter is 23/16 instead of 3/2. It's very similar and it will come out similar, but like you could do 7/7/7/2. So that's 7, 14, 21, 23. But you can't reduce that global meter down anymore because 23 is prime. The way that 24/16 resolves to, or reduces to 12/8 or 6/4 or 3/2. You can't do that with 23/16. But similarly, if we instead add a 16th note, so Ben Monder's version is 7/7/7/3. The 23 version is 7/7/7/2. And if you went up instead and did 7/7/7/4, that gets you 25. And so in this case, the global meter is basically 5 squared, 25. And so it's kind of interesting to see these very similar rhythmic structures on one level have this extra dimension that is totally different, where one is a prime, one is a compound combination of 3 plus 2 raised to some power, and then the third version for 25 is a prime squared. So they all have these different qualities at a global level, but at the end of the day, they're just kind of 7, 7, 7, and a smaller group. So they're all going to sound pretty similar, but they all have this sort of weird thing where the biggest pulse that you can get isn't going to be the same. Anyway, I think that this is an interesting sort of rhythmic device that yields a lot of really cool sort of structures from whatever you do with it. So I'd encourage you to fiddle around with it, see what you think. All right, so just to recap real quick, we talked about dotted rhythms, double dotted rhythms, and how they are kind of utonal reflections of the triplet and the septuplet, how I have a gripe with us not having an utonal reflection of the quintuplet. And then we talked about cool ways to apply these notational conventions to generate interesting cross-rhythmic structures through pseudo-polyrhythms or truncated polyrhythms. And so if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe if you aren't already. Drop a like or a comment. Let me know if you have any questions, if there are any topics you'd like me to cover in particular. And if you like these videos and want to support the Woodshed or the Bridge podcast or anything else I do, please consider heading over to patreon.com/Lambertronics. The smallest tier is $3 a month, and it's super helpful and super encouraging to me to get that positive reinforcement in making these videos and the financial support as well. So if you're able to, it's much appreciated. Otherwise, please share the video and help me expand my audience, because that is also super impactful for me and encourages me to make more of these. So Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks.